it became obvious over time that something would have to be done. We could not go on like this indefinitely. The movement was under great pressure, the guerrillas were under pressure, there was no resources. So a meeting was called in Kabul, where some of the leadership already was, and some, including myself, was called to come and talk. So I want to tell you how I came back home. I took the train from Quetta, landed in Lahore on an early winter morning, a lot of fog, at around 5 or 6 in the morning, got off at the Lahore Cant station, a small station. Didn't want to go to the main station, and in any case was closer to home. Got into a rickshaw, wrapped up in a shawl, and arrived at my father's house on the main boulevard, Gulbarg. In those days, nobody locked their gates. It was a different Pakistan. Now you can't think of it. You not only have a locked gate, you have to have a security armed guard, So I opened the gate, the house was asleep, very early morning. And I went behind, at the back of the house, to my room where I knew Ghazala would be. And I tapped on the window. And I saw her white face appear from behind the curtain. And she took one look at me, I opened the door. The house was locked. And instead of going to open the door, she ran screaming down the corridor to my mother's bedroom. Wo aa gaya, wo aa gaya, wo aa gaya. Completely crazy. They didn't believe I would come. Ghazala wouldn't believe I would come. My mother wouldn't believe I would come. My family didn't believe I would come. They said, this guy is never going to return. Although she'd come back and told them he's coming. But she herself was not totally convinced, I think. So, of course, they all opened the door. You can imagine the scenes, very emotional, because there had been various reports at various times that I had been picked up, I had been killed. There had been all sorts of rumors, all sorts of things. The news of my death was highly exaggerated, if I may so put it. Here I am, sitting in front of you. Now, I wanted to keep my return very quiet. So I told my family, don't tell anybody that I'm back. But about 10 days or 2 weeks later was my father's Chaliswa. I missed his funeral, by the way. It was my father's Chaliswa. And the whole world turned up. And then when the whole world had turned up, I appeared. And people were just completely flabbergasted to see me. I mentioned Shoaib Hashmi. He and another friend, Sami Ahmed, who's passed away, film director, they were just walking in and they saw me standing there. And they just went completely crazy, Because as I say, there were rumors of my death all along. I'd been captured, killed. And then, of course, nobody was convinced that a guy like me would come back. But the movement had imploded by then. It had not been defeated. It had not been able to defeat the Pakistan army, but it had fought it to a standstill. And so you could say that there was an equilibrium. But then all the political problems that had accumulated through this very hard struggle crawled out like worms from the woodwork and created a lot of internal friction and tension and problems and accusations, which usually happens. I was with Ghazala in England, and she was rung up by a friend and told. They didn't know I was with her. But I was underground there also, if you know what I mean, although I was with them. So this friend called her to tell her that my father's passed away. That's how I heard. So the movement, as I said, was not defeated but suffered internal implosion. And so the role for people like us, in any case, was shrinking, even before I came back and certainly after. And the result was that I was the first one to return, but gradually, incrementally, everyone returned. Everyone who was still around, if you know what I mean. Life was difficult during the struggle, before going underground, even more difficult underground. But nothing had prepared me for the difficulties I faced when I came back. I told you that coming back was, nothing had prepared me for what I was going to confront. My father just died. My family was obviously grieving, but also in trouble financially. I didn't have 2 pennies to rub together. I had a wife and young son who was now almost 4, 3.5. He was 6 months when I went away, and now anyway. So I missed his first baby steps and that kind of thing. So there was a big gap as far as his upbringing is concerned, which I missed. But anyway, so we struggled. Ghazala started a small business in her parents' backyard, servant quarters, furniture. And I took up consultancy. I got a few jobs. I'd mentioned earlier that I was running a motor workshop in Karachi. Now, what was the purpose of running a motor workshop in Karachi while I was involved in all this? Well, there were basically 2 reasons. One was that I had got some money from my family and we invested it in this workshop, setting up this workshop, because it did 2 things, we hoped. One was it would generate some income for the party and the movement, and secondly, it would be a very good facility to have, because our logistics did involve long journeys by road, and so we could keep our vehicles in good order. I must tell you that we didn't make much money, but we did manage to service our vehicles and keep those rolling. I didn't know anything about running a motor vehicle workshop. I learnt on the job, and of course that's very costly. So I can't say it was an unmitigated success, but nevertheless it did serve a purpose. Now I want to return to some of my comrades, including my younger brother, Assad Rahman. I told you that I went to study in England in 1965. And in 1969, when I was already deeply into organizing this group of Pakistani students and workers in England, I came home. My sister was getting married, and on my way back, my younger brother Assad, who had got admission in London to do architecture, accompanied me. Now, he knew nothing about all this. He was not political. And I never attempted to proselytize or persuade him. That's not my way of doing things. But it was inevitable. He lived with me, and my flat in Earl's Court was the center of all these activities. Plus another comrade, Humayun Talat, whose flat was also in use for this. And eventually I left this flat and moved in with him. So Assad was with me throughout. And inevitably, even if he was not political to begin with all these political ideas and, things happening around him, swirling around us, inevitably he got pulled in. And it was a very fateful entry, because he was to play a very important role in the guerrilla resistance later. Now, I also mentioned to you that my task was to send batches of people back, and he was one of them. And he proved very adept at the first task with which anybody who went into the mountains in Balochistan was faced. And that was to acquire the culture and mannerism, dress, customs, be aware of the way things worked in that tribal society. He proved very adept at that. He picked up the language very quickly. He acquired the dress, the mannerism, the culture, the customs, the traditions, the ways of doing things very quickly. He proved probably the most adept at that out of the entire group. And he also proved himself in the field as a military commander of some quality. That is the reason why he was the first to be given charge of a guerrilla group on his own. And he led it with distinction and played, as I said, a very important commanding role in the military side of the resistance. He was given the title, the party pseudonym of Chakar Khan. Chakar, the name Chakar, has a lot of resonance in Baloch history because in the 16th century, when the major influx of the Baloch tribes, the second or third wave of the Baloch tribes arrived in Balochistan and settled there were two tribes that were at war with each other, the Rinds and the Lasharis. Now, the Rinds were led by their chieftain Sardar called Chakar Khan Rind. And this war ensued for something like 30 years, off and on. Eventually, the Rinds, I think, tired of this or perhaps were feeling that they could not win and might even lose. So Chakar decided to migrate. The Baloch area extended into what is today part of Punjab. It's called Dera Ghazi Khan. It lies just across, there's a provincial boundary between Dera Ghazi Khan and Balochistan. A lot of Baloch are settled in Dera Ghazi Khan. But like what happened to the Baloch who settled in Sindh, you may or may not be aware of this, but there is a considerable minority, and some say even majority, of Baloch ethnic people settled in Sindh. Of course, they have become assimilated and speak Sindhi as a norm. Some of them still speak Balochi also. But if you look at their tribes and the genealogy of their tribes, you will find that they are Baloch. So just as there was this, out-migration from Balochistan into Sindh, similarly there was an out-migration from Balochistan into Punjab, the adjoining areas of Punjab, southern Punjab, including DG Khan. There are a lot of Baloch even today in Multan. But they too were assimilated over time. And by and large, they are either Punjabi or Saraiki speaking. Some of them may still speak Balochi. But if you look at their, again, tribal genealogy, you'll find they are Baloch. Now, he traveled via DG Khan and finally settled somewhere near Sahiwal, from where he joined forces with the Mughal emperor, Humayun, who was trying to get his throne back. He was overthrown by a rival and went into exile in Iran, and then when he finally came back, gathered his army. This Baloch contingent led by Chakar Rind accompanied him in his reconquest of the Delhi throne. As reward, Chakar Rind was given lands near Sahiwal, and he's actually buried there. He's a great Baloch hero from history. So that name given to Assad, as I said, had a lot of resonance. And I don't want to exaggerate, but I think the resonance of that name historically, and I think his exploits in the military field, in the guerrilla resistance, made him a kind of hero in Balochistan. Unfortunately, he passed away 2 years ago. And you cannot imagine the outpouring of condolence and messages to me on his passing away. Obviously, it was a great shock to me. Losing elders is one thing, but losing someone younger than you is a great shock because it seems to go against the law of nature. But these things happen. So Chakar Khan, Assad Rahman, is a very well-known name and figure in Balochistan, and reference is made to him constantly whenever I meet people from there. I suppose inevitably, we were very close when we were growing up because he was just 2 years younger than me. So we were playmates, okay? And that inevitably, creates a sort of rapport. I was his elder brother, I suppose. Inevitably, naturally, he did look up to me. When I left for England in 65, he was still relatively young. He grew up while I was away. And acquired some expertise in martial arts as an interest. Judo, karate, what have you. Some of which he demonstrated on me when I came home on holiday. Much to my annoyance. He was good. But anyway, so he was one very important inductee, and to answer your question again, did he look up to me in terms of the political struggle, in terms of the what we were getting into? At the risk of some immodesty, I must tell you that I was one of the central figures of that group. So I guess he and some others did perhaps look up to me. There were others from our background, relatively privileged, some from Punjab, but a lot of others from all over Pakistan. But I'll mention a few names that you may be familiar with and that your viewers may be familiar with. One I mentioned is Najm Sethi, who, as I told you, it was his arrest that followed my having to go underground when he was shanghaied in the Murray area in the hands of the military. The other gentleman who may be embarrassed by this revelation now is Ahmed Rashid, who's a very well-known author and journalist, and his famous book, The Taliban, is an international bestseller, and he's now considered one of, if not the leading analysts on Afghanistan, Central Asia, and so on. And it's interesting how Ahmed Rashid was inducted into this movement. He wasn't part of it to begin with. I met him through his cousin, Zinat Anis, who had become my comrade and friend, close friend. And she had been imbued with these ideas because she took a trip to Cuba and cut cane in the sugar fields, in the sugarcane fields. So she was so inspired by the Cuban revolution that she became a comrade inevitably, I suppose. And Ahmed was her cousin, and she introduced me to him and said, this is a cousin that you should perhaps invest some time and effort in. The rest is history. He did join me, and then eventually it's he who was studying at Cambridge at the time and was very close with my childhood friend Najm Sethi, who was also at Cambridge, and in fact they were sharing a house. So he is responsible for bringing Sethi into this. So this triumvirate from Lahore, if you like, or quartet, I should say, Assad included. One of my comrades, Dilip Das, who is known to everybody as Johnny, again was our comrade in England. He also went to do accountancy, got fed up with it, was looking for something else in life, and was an obvious recruit for what was going on around him. He travelled actually with Sethi and me back from England by road, the road trip that I mentioned. And then of course we dispatched him to the front, where he acquitted himself with great valour, courage and commitment. Previously when we were training in courses in England, he was our best machinist. He learned to do that very well. He was very meticulous, so obviously he was good at that. Now, he also, as developments took place, and as the fighting imposed on us the necessity to operate groups autonomously, so he was in charge of one group, on the political side of it at least. And it is from there, in the middle of all the, as I mentioned to you, Tolpod, when I went underground, in the circumstances in which I went underground, his isolation from logistics and supply made him and his group quite desperate. They contacted someone in the urban organization in Quetta who, unbeknownst to them and to us, had been turned by intelligence. He's actually the person who, I mentioned to you, a comrade who was caught in Quetta and was being tortured badly, and after a month sent us a message, please take care, because I don't know how much longer I can hold out. He was fingered by this man. So he was clearly a double agent. We had not discovered it at the time. And Johnny placed himself in his care along with a comrade to come down and see me, to see if the logistics problem, supply problem could be sorted out. On the way, because the betrayal was there, on the way they were caught, tortured, killed, and their bodies disappeared. To this day, we've never found them. And it's a very human tragedy, because his parents never achieved closure, although they found out about his death later. But poor old people, I mean, they just, it's very painful to have a child die and not know, and not see his body and not bury him. So these are one of the tragedies. I think what was new about this movement, perhaps I should dilate on that a little, was I told you that we were already fairly skeptical about the left in Pakistan, and that is the reason why we had decided to come back and explore before we committed to anything. We were not sure of the existing left groups, parties and so on. In fact, we were quite critical of them. But we had kept an open mind, to the extent at least that we would go home and explore and then see what would happen. So what we were looking for really was a departure from what the left had been doing in the past. The departure presented itself, perchance, by our coming into contact with the Balochistan movement. And what was different about it was that we, despite being Marxist revolutionaries, placed the national question center stage. We would not have gone into the Balochistan movement had we not been aware of that, conscious of it, sensitive to it. And I think with hindsight one can say that that was not wrong, because the issue of nationalities and federating units played itself out in the East Pakistan crisis, played itself out in the military repression in Balochistan and the resistance to it, to some extent has from time to time recurred in Sindh against the nationalists. For years the Pashtun nationalists, particularly those who advocated Pashtunistan, were considered enemies of the state and suffered as a result. So you can see that there was at the heart of the Pakistani state structure a very real issue. These nationalities, ethnic groups, whatever you want to call them, were historically evolved entities and identities. They could not so easily be wiped out, not even by one unit. In fact, what one unit did was to strengthen this identity. So an identity crisis has been at the heart of Pakistan from day one. And I think to some extent it still continues, because the attempt over time to subsume these disparate, separate, different identities into one overarching one based on religion, i.e. Islam, and on Pakistani nationalism, proved unable to overcome these identities and to meld them into some kind of, melting pot where we would all become Pakistanis instead of being Punjabis, Bengalis, Baloch, Pashtun, and so on. This problem still persists. It has not gone away. The movement may have been, it may have imploded internally, but we have another insurgency going on in Balochistan today, long after that one ended. So that tells you something about the permanence of this issue or this problem. So on the one hand, it was a departure in the sense that we placed the national question center stage. It was also an attempt to use that as an entry point, but by no means were we wanting to limit ourselves to Balochistan. In fact, I think I mentioned earlier that we had allies in all Pakistan, all the provinces, all the ethnic groups, but not all of them came through. That too happens in struggles, you know. The issue of Balochistan, if we get into it in some detail, tells us the following. Number one, as I mentioned, there was this question of accession, which was forcibly resolved. And in my view, that forcible annexation is not an issue that has been settled. It might have had a chance of being settled had the state chosen to engage with the Baloch, to mainstream them, to make them stakeholders and citizens, offer them redress of their grievances over time, and perhaps, fulfill the hopes of that section of Baloch political opinion which argued for struggling within the system, as opposed to insurgency or armed struggle. Mr. Ghaus Bakhsh Bizenjo is well known as an advocate of that line, and he disagreed even with the 70s struggle. But anyway, what are the grievances? A, the annexation. B, the treatment after, some of which I mentioned, a whole series of broken promises and repression, which didn't help the case. Then in 1952, natural gas was discovered in Sui, which is near the Bukti area. And for the next 33 years at least, that gas helped to fuel the industrial development of what was then West Pakistan, and was used as a domestic fuel all over the country. But Balochistan never saw a drop of it. So, you can see the resentment building up there already. Here is a natural resource that comes out of Baloch soil and yet is not available to the Baloch. It wasn't until 1985 when Ziaul Haq, as I said, was trying to settle things with the Baloch because he had his hands full with the PPP and others, that he sanctioned the supply of gas to Quetta alone. Even now, if you travel through the length and breadth of Balochistan, there are very few areas where gas is available. And it's a cold area, winters are harsh and people rely on firewood and coal to keep themselves warm. Gas is only available in some areas, not the province as a whole. And by now, of course, we're running out of gas. So, that's an issue which has kind of outlived its shelf life, shall we say. Now, the other issue is that being a tribal and nomadic society, there were some special prerequisites for the development of Balochistan which are not always taken into account, or that the federal structures were not sensitive to. Even after East Pakistan was lost, and Bhutto Sahab in his 72-73 constitutions brought about some attempted to bring together the provinces in some kind of national unity while providing for a limited amount of provincial autonomy, something that the Baloch MNAs actually were opposed to because they thought it was insufficient, and that's why they didn't sign the 73 constitution. But anyway, that problem of provincial autonomy, there had been armed struggles against one unit, I told you, against military dictatorship, Ayub Khan. That was not resolved to the satisfaction of any of the provinces. And it wasn't until the 18th Amendment that something really major happened. And, the promises that were made at the time of the promulgation of the 73 Constitution, that within 10 years, for example, the concurrent list, which was the list of subjects in the Constitution, that the federal and provincial governments shared, but over which the federal government had, first priority. It was supposed to be abolished in 10 years and those subjects given to the provinces. But of course, that intent was overtaken by the military coup in 77 and Mr. Bhutto's hanging in 79. Ziaul Haq was not interested. And it wasn't until the 18th Amendment that concurrent list has been abolished and those subjects have been devolved to the provinces. Der aaye durust aaye. The provinces don't have the capacity to handle the subjects that they've been now delivered on a platter, and there seems to be no visible effort to acquire that capacity so far. So this is a work in progress. Changing state structures from a highly centralized system to a devolved one, and of course there is still the burning issue of devolving it further to local bodies, which still hangs in fire. So these are issues that I think Pakistan has failed to wrestle with and paid the price for, in terms of lack of national unity, lack of national cohesive identity. Even today, despite all the statements to the effect that we should all think of ourselves as Pakistanis, our history doesn't persuade. Well, I think the flaw lies in the origins of the Pakistan movement. You see, what was the thrust of the Muslim communities, let's say, what was its political thrust leading up to independence? Up to about 1916, Congress and Muslim League were together as, component parts of the nationalist independence struggle. Mr. Jinnah himself, along with so many others, was both a member of Muslim League and Congress, and that was permitted at the time. 1916, there's a break with Mr. Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi returns from South Africa and, in Mr. Jinnah's view, introduces through the back door, through his appeal to traditional Hindu culture, introduces religion into politics. He opposes that, ironically, at the time, and in fact is, forced to leave Congress because taking on Mr. Gandhi proves very difficult in Congress. And disgusted with the trends that are emerging in the independence movement, Mr. Jinnah, disillusioned, leaves India, goes off to London to practice, and is not politically active until the early 30s, when there are roundtable conferences in London between the British and the Indian parties as to how to proceed towards independence. Autonomy first and then independence. And by 1935 then, he is persuaded by Iqbal, most of all, to return to India and to take charge of the Muslim League, which otherwise Iqbal feels is a failing party and will leave the Muslims stranded. Up to that point, the Muslims are not asking for a separate state. They are asking for safeguards for their rights as a considerable minority in the subcontinent. They were, I think, at the time anything up to 33% of the populace. So it's not a small minority. And do not forget that they were historically coming out of being the ruling elite. So, after 1857, they lost out. Once the Mughal Empire was finished, the British took over, and the Muslim, and particularly their ruling elite, the aristocracy, was marginalized and even put upon by the British, accusing them of having been, leaders of the rebellion. So there's a long decline in Muslim power after the British takeover, and the void or vacuum is filled by Hindu nationalism, an assertion by the Hindus in a revanchist sense, in the sense that the resentment against Muslim rule, which lasted so long, plays itself out in the form of a reassertion of Hindu identity and Hindu culture and Hindu nationalism. Gandhi, whether he intended to or not, tapped into that when he came back. His argument was that without mobilizing the overwhelming majority of the Indian population, which still resided in the villages, there was no way the independence movement would win. Now, when he went to the peasantry, he went with a message of distancing themselves from British rule, British culture, and even the British economy. For instance, his emphasis on the charkha, which is now, by the way, the emblem on the Indian flag. What was it about? It was about denying the British a monopoly of the cloth trade, and particularly cotton in India. He wanted the Indian peasant to return to the self-sufficient ways of the past, whereby they would, spin the thread on the charkha, then weave it and make their own cloth. And so the Swadeshi movement, as he called it, which was, foreign goods. Foreign goods are to be rejected because the textile mills of Britain were running at least considerably on raw material from India and a market in India. So when you stop buying British goods, textile goods in particular, and go back to a traditional way of making cloth and wearing it, then obviously it's a blow to British colonialism. But in this attempt to mobilize, he not only went to the economy, he also went to culture and, a belief system. And so when he talks about Ram Raj, for example, it's a religious symbol. It's a religious symbolism. It does appeal to the peasantry, which is still largely religious. But it has the divisive effect then of not being inclusive and possibly distancing or alienating all non-Hindu communities in the subcontinent, including this considerable minority, the Muslims. So the Muslims feel not only the decline since 1857, not only the marginalization, efforts like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan setting up the Aligarh University were precisely to give what was regarded as the increasingly backward Muslim community as compared with the Hindu, English education and equip them to compete for jobs, economic opportunity and various other things under British rule. So what this did, what British rule did, was to create, in fact, an elite educated in English, what were later referred to disparagingly as the Brown Sahibs, and they came from both communities eventually. The Hindu community had a lead, as I said, but then the Muslims also caught up. So people like Mr. Jinnah are very much a product of that. Even Mr. Gandhi. This was the elite, tutored in English ways and in English education, but of course, because they are from the soil and rooted in that soil and under colonial occupation, also impelled them towards nationalism. So I think at the point where Mr. Jinnah comes back, the only thought that is running through his mind and the minds of the Muslim elite is what to do, what should our demands be. So to begin with, they put out the platform of provincial autonomy, particularly for those provinces where Muslims were in a majority, throughout the subcontinent. Now, that begins to gel eventually into the idea in 1940 in the Lahore Resolution of a state or two states even, northwest, northeast, which would be Muslim overwhelmingly in character. Although the populations were mixed at that time. No one could boast of a purely Muslim province or a purely Hindu province anywhere in the subcontinent. That being the way history evolves. They lived cheek by jowl. They were neighbors. The communities coexisted. largely peacefully, I might add. The conflict was not on a religious basis, if there was any. It became eventually, because as Jinnah Sahab critiqued, you are introducing, Mr. Gandhi, religion into politics through the back door. Provincial autonomy is what the Muslim League started with. But it is the inability of the majority community and the majority party that claim to represent that majority community, the Congress, to accommodate the concerns of this considerable minority, which led to a deepening of the cleft or the gulf between the two, and impelled the Muslim League increasingly, incrementally, towards the demand for a separate state. This is the history. I'm capsuling it, but this is the way it went. So the whole struggle is about the rights of this considerable minority community, whether in the form of provincial autonomy or later a separate state, the contours of that state, and the kind of state and society which would emerge should such a demand be finally accepted, was never worked out in great detail. The result is that whereas Pakistan comes into being on the 14th of August 1947, everybody has been talking about the Muslim-Hindu divide up to then. Nobody's been talking about what this state, overwhelmingly Muslim but not entirely Muslim, will be. What will be its contours? What will be its shape? What will be its policy? On the 11th of August, 3 days before independence, Mr. Jinnah addresses the Constituent Assembly, his famous speech.
आप सब आजाद हैं अपने मंदिरों में जाने के लिए, आप सब आजाद हैं अपनी मस्जिदों में जाने के लिए और किसी भी और इबादतगाह में जाने के लिए इस ममलिकत पाकिस्तान में। आपका ताल्लुक किसी भी मजहब, जात या अकीदे से हो, ममलिकत का इससे कोई सरोकार नहीं। आप देखेंगे कि वक्त गुजरने के साथ साथ हिंदू हिंदू नहीं रहेंगे और मुसलमान मुसलमान नहीं रहेंगे, मजहबी मानों में नहीं, क्योंकि ये हर फर्द का जाती अकीदा है, बल्कि सियासी मानों में वो एक ही रियासत के बराबर के शहरी होंगे।
In which he removes religion from the state and says that's got nothing to do with the state, that's your personal belief. And with the evolution of time, evolution over time, people will stop being Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Sikhs and whatever. Not in the religious sense, because that is their individual faith, but in the political sense as far as the state is concerned. The state will keep itself out of religion and treat every citizen equally with equal rights. Now it's a ringing declaration and a very fundamental statement of what he wanted the state to be. But the tragedy is, and here I can only refer to Mr. Jinnah as a character out of a Greek tragedy. The flaw. What is the flaw? The flaw is you have gone on a different tangent for years, mobilized a whole community on the basis of that, and even given rise to slogans that are purely religious in color, like Pakistan ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah. Okay? So the identity of the movement is increasingly, whether you like it or not, religious. 11th August is an attempt by Mr. Jinnah, the original secular nationalist, who adopted this as a tactic probably rather than as a deeply held belief. I mean, he was not averse to Islam or Muslims or their history or their belief systems, but he didn't want to base the state on that. So it's an attempt to correct course, but it is too little, too late. The genie is out of the bottle. The very thing that he criticized Gandhi for, introducing religion into politics, consciously or inadvertently, he's fallen into that too. Now this is the great dilemma that confronts Pakistan at independence. Jinnah Sahab wants us to return to his secular nationalist worldview, but we are too far gone down the road, the other road, to now pull back. We have not only unleashed the genie, we've unleashed the forces that support the Jinnah. The mullahs, the religious parties, the others who, many of them, oppose the demand for Pakistan or a separate Muslim state because they argued against territoriality for a Muslim state and argued for pan-Islamism. You know, people like the Jamaat-e-Islami, people like the JUI. Okay? This is a matter of record. I'm not stating anything new. But when Pakistan came into being, they not only accepted it, they wanted to become its thekedars. And that is the genesis, if you like, once Mr. Jinnah is gone, of the 1949 Objectives Resolution, which is introduced first as a preface and later by General Zia, is made a substantive part of the Constitution. So you have actually put the state on a religious basis. You have made Islam the religion of the state. Now that does two things. First, that is now the unifying principle to which you are appealing. On the other hand, it alienates every non-Muslim community in the state. And they were not inconsiderable at the time of partition. But because of the way the movement went and the way the state emerged and the conflict between the different religious communities, you get the massacres, the communal bloodshed. And that embitters everything to this day. You know, India-Pakistan wars have disparagingly been referred to sometimes as communal riots with tanks. And I think that is a reference, a light-hearted reference to the origins of the conflict, which was communal in nature. Now, these issues and these problems needed not just a speech by Mr. Jinnah on 11th August, which proved insufficient because the polity didn't accept it, quite apart from anybody else. In fact, that speech was suppressed for a long time. I don't know if you're aware of that. So the blueprint that Mr. Jinnah presents is, thrown out the window. Because as I say, the momentum of the movement has gone too far down another road. And no serious attempt was made to re-examine or revisit this and see on what basis this new state that had come into being, on the basis of pre-existing, historically evolved, ethnic, cultural, nationalist identities. So the biggest mistake, for instance, begins in 1948 when Mr. Jinnah visits East Pakistan and declares there that Urdu will be the national language of Pakistan.
Let me make it very clear to you, and leave no doubt, that the state language of Pakistan is going to be Urdu and no other language.
The construct is Islam binding force, Urdu the national language binding force, and so on. Why Urdu? It's a good question, isn't it? Urdu was not the native language of East Pakistan, it was Bengali. It was not even the native language of any of the constituent units of West Pakistan. Why Urdu? Because in the Muslim revival attempt stemming from the 19th century, Urdu becomes the language that Muslims employ, obviously historically received from the Mughal court and so on, and from Mughal, from Muslim Mughal culture, becomes the lingua franca, the language in which Muslim aspirations are expressed and so on and so forth. So it seems natural and inevitable that it should be the language of the new state. And yet, a bland assertion of that fails to see the ground realities. So when Mr. Jinnah declares in 48 in East Pakistan, Urdu will be the national language, he evokes riots, student riots. And some of those students are killed. And as a result, you have, Language Martyrs Day in East Pakistan, and you have a whole movement suddenly emerging of that identity, Bengali identity. And you know the consequences of that in later years. Balochistan's case is not very different, Sindh's case is not very different, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa's case is not very different in these terms. Their identities were denied, their historically evolved identities were denied, and they were asked to subsume those into this cementing force called Islam, and use Urdu as the binding force, if you like, or the lingua franca. These things can't be imposed. Despite the imposition and despite the resentment against the imposition, East Pakistan is a separate case. Let's leave that aside for a minute. But what is Pakistan today? The natural evolution has made Urdu the lingua franca anyway, despite the resentment. That was the way to go. There are some processes that cannot be imposed from the top. They have to emerge organically from society itself and then go through the stages of the dynamic that makes them what they are. And I think Urdu is a very good example of that. But the resentments, despite, as I'm saying, you see, why do languages become lingua francas? The market, trade, merchants talking to each other, the state, administration, the interaction between the citizen and the state. Not everybody speaks English, remember. So these are natural things. Now I take you back a little in history. When the British defeated the Sikh Empire and conquered Punjab, they already had a well-developed, smoothly lubricated, functioning administration in one of the earliest provinces they had conquered after Bengal, and that was UP. Now that was obviously an administration run in Urdu, English at the top, Urdu below. Historically, the court always spoke Persian and the populace spoke Hindustani, as it was then called. We hadn't made the distinction between Urdu and Hindi yet. The lingua franca. Even in the Sikh court, at the height of the Sikh Empire, the court conducted its dealings in Persian, and below was Punjabi, written in the Gurmukhi script. And incidentally, the Muslims in Punjab did produce a script to write Punjabi in. It's called Shahmukhi, and it is based on the Urdu script. It didn't, in my view, phonetically answer all the needs of Punjabi, which has certain sounds like all languages that are not conveyed in the Urdu alphabet. But that need not have been such an obstacle because, for example, Sindhi, which bases itself on the Arabic script, did produce letters of the alphabet to phonetically answer all the needs of the language, which are different from Arabic. Okay, so that can be done. I mean, linguistic, innovation can take place to render a spoken or an oral language into a properly written one, with all the phonetics taken care of. So when the British conquered the Sikh Empire, they brought en masse an already existing administration or administrators from UP to run things in Punjab. So what happened was Farsi at the higher level of administration and the court, and Punjabi at the lower administrative level, and the same was true of education, by the way. The medium of instruction generally for education was Punjabi, and then of course they also learned Farsi because it was the language of higher administration in the court. Like what happened later with English and Urdu. And it's a parallel development because when the British brought this administration wholesale from UP, they introduced Urdu as the language of lower administration, the courts, and even incrementally education. Whereas higher administration, the state, higher courts, and higher education was conducted in English. So you get this divide, whereas previously the two languages were coexistent and taught equally. Here suddenly you began to now see a divide between what would pass for the medium of instruction and the learning language for the great majority, and an elite which would be educated in English ways, turned into Brown Saabs and become loyal subjects of the British Crown. So there is a conscious policy here. Now what happened in Punjab as a result is of great interest, because the Muslims, when the British took over, there was so much hatred and resentment of some of the things the Sikhs had done during their stint in power, on a religious basis as well as on a community basis, that they embraced Urdu at the lower level and English at the higher level and rejected Punjabi. They rejected it as a Sikh language. They rejected the script in which it was written as a Sikh script. And although Shah Mukhi existed, they rejected the language. And that is the reason historically why approximately 200 years ago, the Muslim Punjabis moved increasingly away from Punjabi. So much so that in today's urban Pakistan, in any given Punjabi household, you are unlikely to hear Punjabi, you are going to hear Urdu or English. So this is something, a history that has taken place. But a similar process cannot be detected in any of the other constituent parts of the new state of Pakistan. So their identity was much stronger, longer lasting, and perhaps existing to this day, whereas Punjab became increasingly, in my view, and without meaning to offend anybody, mongrelized. That is one of the difficulties that Punjab has even today in Pakistan, identity and who we are and what we are. So while we are in this angst of discovering whatever we are in terms of identity, the others are very clear and sure. So you see the divide here also. That is why Punjabis find it very difficult to understand someone who asserts an identity different from Pakistani, Muslim, ek kitab, ek zuban, etc., etc. They find it very difficult to understand that. But you have to go and have a lived experience of the other parts of Pakistan to understand why this has happened and to know that history and how it's different from yours. But Punjabis, because they are a relatively prosperous province and well ensconced in the corridors of power, very few have taken an interest in this issue. So by and large, Punjab is kind of oblivious. The general run of opinion in Punjab is oblivious of this identity issue. It tended to subsume, at least during the nationalist movement, all other identities. Yeah. But it's not a problem at that point. It becomes a problem when Pakistan comes into being, when the denial of all other identities produces a reaction. So whereas Bengalis had no problem with being part of the Muslim League movement, in fact they were arguably, apart from UP, the main force in the demand for Muslim identity, autonomy, later separation. Mr. Sohrawardi, who became Prime Minister of Pakistan later under the 56 Constitution, was a considerable figure in Bengal. He was in fact the Chief Minister of United Bengal before partition. So a considerable figure in Bengal. And yet a lieutenant of the Qaid, Mr. Jinnah. Similarly, G.M. Sayyid, who later became a Sindhi nationalist, was the man who moved in 1942 the resolution in support of Pakistan in the Sindh Assembly. If anyone was distant from this general run of Muslim opinion and sentiment, it was Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, which was hardly a province, it was an agency, a governor's agency, and Punjab, which ironically was, under a very different party, secular, composed largely of the Punjabi landlords, and which didn't see eye to eye with the Muslim League until very late in the day. So you see, The Pakistan that came into being required an answer. Now that we were beyond the independence movement and had become a state, required an answer to these questions and these assertions that identity cannot simply be wiped away, history cannot simply be wiped away, culture, language cannot simply be wiped away. They were meant to be accommodated. Because the state did not, by and large, therefore Pakistan has had a singularly critical fracture at its very heart. I think, for lack of a better explanation, I think it's inertia. I don't think there is positivity that is holding us together. I think what is holding us together is A, lack of option, lack of alternative, and possibly the difficulty of creating that alternative or option. And therefore people are surviving with what exists, not necessarily happily, all of them, but for lack of alternative. You needed to get over your insecurity that, allowing a bouquet of identities, cultures, languages would in any way threaten your project of wanting us all to be speaking Urdu and being Pakistani. As far as education is concerned, I'm sure you're aware of the studies all over the world which show that the best way to tackle education, and particularly illiteracy, of which we have plenty, is to start off education, at least up to the primary level, in the mother language. Why is it called a mother language? It's called a mother language because it's the first language the child learns in the lap of the mother. Why is it important to start off education in the mother tongue? Because the ability of the child to learn is enhanced and accelerated. No language is simply a language. It is a means of conveying ideas, concepts. And it is also a cultural construct. So many of the values of any community or any society are passed on through the generations through the medium of the language, but they bring with them the entire baggage of the evolution of that society, its culture, its history, its landmarks, its seminal points, and so on and so forth. So the idea is, all the research shows, you start a child off in the mother tongue, and then you introduce other languages at appropriate levels along the education ladder. Some say at primary level, some say earlier. That's a debate. But nobody has argued a better case than the advocates of the mother tongue as a medium of instruction to begin with. The results are obvious. The child learns very quickly because the references are familiar. They are mother tongue references, and they bring with them a whole cultural construct. So what Pakistan should have done, had it got over this obsession which stems from the nationalist movement of being one, this monotheistic kind of approach to national identity is at the root of the problem. Had they allowed these identities, cultures and languages to flourish and introduced the other languages, lingua francas, connecting languages, bonding languages, which evolved anyway, as I said. The actions of the market, the interactions of government, state, society, people, it produces a natural coming together, communication. Had that been done, I think many of the problems, I don't say all of them, would have been moving towards some kind of resolution, because nobody would feel resentful. Their identity was intact, historically evolved identity was intact. They were now acquiring another layer of identity, and that would have brought people together voluntarily, not by imposition. The problem with the Pakistani state has been from day one trying to impose its preconceived notions and ideas on a ground reality which is not responsive. And it cannot be responsive unless these things organically grow from below. So I think the argument by now, it may be that, people in positions of authority are still not clear about this, but I'm very clear about it, that we took a wrong turn. And many of our problems and many of the setbacks we've had in our history can be traced back to this.